What if the very things you fear the most about yourself are not your enemies but your allies? What if those shadows, the parts of you you've buried and avoided, are not flaws to be fixed but sources of untapped strength, wisdom, and individuality? Carl Jung believed that the parts of ourselves we fear and suppress, the traits, desires, and emotions we've pushed into the unconscious, hold critical keys to our growth and purpose. He called this the shadow, and understanding it is not just an intellectual exercise, it's an act of courage. Let's start with this. Why do we fear parts of ourselves at all? What makes us hide certain feelings or impulses in the first place? Jung believed it starts early. As children, we learn which behaviors, emotions, and traits are acceptable and rewarded, and which are punished or rejected. Over time, to fit in, to be loved, or to avoid shame, we begin suppressing the parts of ourselves that don't align with these expectations. Maybe you were told that being angry was wrong, so you learned to suppress your anger. Maybe you were shamed for being sensitive, so you began hiding your vulnerability. Or maybe you were criticized for being too ambitious or too bold, so you started to downplay your drive.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
But here's the problem: when we suppress these parts of ourselves, they don't disappear. They go underground. They become part of the shadow, lurking in the unconscious, where they still influence us, often in ways we don't realize. Think about it. Have you ever had an explosive outburst seemingly out of nowhere? Or maybe you repeatedly sabotage yourself in certain situations. These moments aren't random, they're the shadow breaking through. And the more you suppress it, the more control it has. Here's the kicker: the shadow isn't inherently bad. It's not the villain of your story. Jung believed the shadow contains as much potential as it does destruction. It's not just where your suppressed anger or envy lives, it's also where your creativity, passion, and individuality hide. The shadow is everything you are but refuse to acknowledge. And unless you face it, you can't fully understand yourself. Let's make this real. Imagine you have a deep fear of failure. You avoid taking risks because the idea of failing feels unbearable. On the surface, this seems like a rational fear. No one likes to fail. But if you dig deeper, you might find something surprising. Maybe your fear of failure isn't about failure itself, but about what it represents. Maybe it's tied to a belief that your worth is tied to your success, or that failing means you're weak or incompetent. These beliefs didn't come out of nowhere. They were shaped by your experiences, your upbringing, and the societal messages you've absorbed. And here's the twist: these beliefs are part of your shadow. They're influencing your actions, your decisions, and your sense of self, even though you're not fully aware of them. So what do? Jung would say you have to confront the shadow. You have to turn toward the parts of yourself you fear and see them for what they are. This isn't easy. The shadow doesn't like to be exposed. It thrives in the dark, and bringing it into the light can feel deeply uncomfortable. But it's the only way to take back control of your life. Here's a question for you: what part of yourself do you avoid the most? Is it your anger, your envy, your ambition, your vulnerability? Whatever it is, that's where your shadow lives. And that's the part of you that needs your attention the most. Jung believed that facing the shadow is an act of integration. It's not about fixing yourself or getting rid of the shadow, it's about making it part of a larger whole. It's about bringing the unconscious into consciousness so that you can understand and work with it instead of being controlled by it. This is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming your true, authentic self by integrating all parts of your psyche, including the ones you fear. But how do you actually do this? How do you face the shadow without getting overwhelmed by it? Let's break it down. The first step is awareness. You can't confront what you don't see. Start by paying attention to your reactions, especially the moments when you feel triggered or overly emotional. These are often clues that the shadow is at play. For example, if you find yourself constantly annoyed by someone's arrogance, ask yourself, could this be a reflection of something in me? Maybe you've suppressed your own confidence, and seeing someone else express it makes you uncomfortable. Or if you're jealous of someone's success, ask yourself, what does this jealousy say about my own desires and insecurities? The traits we judge most harshly in others are often the ones we've buried in ourselves. The second step is acceptance. This is where most people get stuck. When we uncover parts of ourselves that we don't like, our anger, our selfishness, our fear, it's tempting to reject them all over again. But rejection only strengthens the shadow. Instead, Jung urged us to accept these traits as part of who we are. Acceptance doesn't mean acting on every impulse or indulging every emotion. It means acknowledging that these parts of you exist and that they're not inherently bad. They're just parts of you that need to be understood and integrated. The third step is transformation. Once you've brought the shadow into the light, you can begin to work with it. This is where the real growth happens. Instead of letting your anger control you, you can channel it into healthy boundaries or passionate advocacy. Instead of letting your fear paralyze you, you can use it as a guide to what matters most to you. Instead of resenting your envy, you can use it as motivation to pursue your own goals. The shadow isn't something to fight, it's something to harness. Here's something to think about: what would happen if you stopped running from the parts of yourself you fear? What if, instead of seeing them as obstacles, you saw them as opportunities? What could you learn from your anger, your envy, your fear, your ambition? What potential might be hiding in the parts of you you've kept in the dark? This is where Jung's philosophy becomes life-changing. He believed that the shadow doesn't just hold your fears and insecurities, it also holds your greatest potential. The traits you've buried are often the ones that make you unique, powerful, and capable of extraordinary things. But you'll never access that potential if you keep running from it. Think about it this way: the shadow is like a locked treasure chest. On the surface, it's dark and intimidating, but inside it holds something valuable, something uniquely yours. The key to unlocking that treasure is courage. The courage to face the parts of yourself you've avoided. The courage to accept yourself fully, not just the good parts, but the messy, complicated, human parts too, and the courage to act on what you discover. So what's the next step for you? What's one fear, one insecurity, one hidden trait you're willing to face today? It doesn't have to be huge. Start small. Maybe it's admitting to yourself that you're angry about something and exploring why. Maybe it's acknowledging a desire you've suppressed and giving yourself permission to pursue it. Or maybe it's simply sitting with a difficult emotion instead of pushing it away. The side you fear needs you because it's part of you. And when you embrace it, when you bring it into the light, you don't just heal, you grow. You become more whole, more authentic, and more capable of living a life that's truly your own. And that, as Jung would say, is the ultimate purpose of human existence: to become who you truly are. The shadow as a source of power and authenticity. Let's talk about what happens when you stop treating your shadow as a threat and start seeing it as a source of power. Most people think that what makes them strong is their ability to suppress their undesirable traits, to hide their anger, their selfishness, their fear. But Jung believed the opposite. He argued that your strength comes not from rejection, but from integration. The shadow isn't the thing that weakens you, it's the thing that completes you. When you finally face the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, you stop being fragmented. You become whole. Here's the paradox: the parts of yourself you fear the most are often the parts with the most potential. Think about anger, for example. For many people, anger is something to be ashamed of. Maybe you grew up in a household where anger was punished, so you learned to suppress it. But anger isn't inherently destructive. It's fuel, it's energy. When it's channeled in a healthy way, it can become a force for change. It can help you stand up for yourself, protect the things you care about, and fight for what's right. Suppressing anger doesn't make it go away. It just makes it uncontrollable. But when you face it, when you understand it, you can use it. The same is true for other shadow traits. Take envy. On the surface, envy feels like a petty, negative emotion. It's uncomfortable to admit that you're envious of someone else's success, relationships, or talents. But envy has something important to tell you. It points directly to the things you want most in life. It's a signal, a guide. When you stop pretending it's not there, you can start using it. Instead of letting envy make you bitter, you can let it motivate you. You can let it show you where to focus your energy. Here's the truth: Jung understood the shadow isn't just a collection of flaws. It's also where your individuality lies. The parts of yourself you've suppressed are often the parts that make you unique. Maybe you've hidden your creativity because you were told it wasn't practical. Or maybe you've buried your ambition because you were afraid of being judged. These are the parts of you that, when embraced, can set you apart. They're the key to living authentically. But let's not sugarcoat this. Facing the shadow is hard. It's uncomfortable. It means admitting things about yourself that you'd rather ignore. It means confronting the ways you've sabotaged yourself, hurt others, or avoided responsibility. And it means acknowledging that you're not just the good version of yourself that you show to the world. You're also the messy, imperfect, complicated person you've tried to hide. This is why most people avoid the shadow. It's easier to live on the surface, to stick to the mask of who you think you're supposed to be. But here's what happens when you avoid the shadow: you give it control. The parts of yourself you suppress don't disappear, they just go underground. And when they reappear, they do so in ways you can't control. Maybe it's through explosive anger or passive aggression or self-sabotage. Or maybe it's through projection, blaming others for the traits you can't face in yourself. Jung believed that projection is one of the clearest signs of an unacknowledged shadow. If you find yourself constantly irritated by someone else's arrogance, for example, it's worth asking, is this something I've suppressed in myself? If you're jealous of someone's success, does it point to your own unfulfilled desires? This isn't about blaming yourself. It's about taking responsibility. When you stop projecting your shadow onto others, you take back your power. You stop being controlled by your unconscious fears and start living with awareness. And awareness is the first step toward transformation. Let's take this a step further. Jung believed that the shadow isn't just personal, it's also collective. Just as individuals have shadows, so do societies. Think about the traits and behaviors that your culture rejects or condemns. These collective shadows show up in the way groups project their fears onto others through stereotypes, scapegoating, and discrimination. Jung argued that understanding the collective shadow is just as important as understanding your personal one. If you can see how society's shadow influences you, you can start to break free from it. You can stop being a passive participant in the collective unconscious and start living as an individual. Now let's talk about what happens when you integrate the shadow. Integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or indulging every emotion. It means understanding them. It means recognizing that your anger, your envy, your fear, and your ambition are all parts of you, and that they all have something to teach you. When you integrate the shadow, you become more balanced. You stop swinging between extremes and start living from a place of wholeness. This is what Jung meant by individuation. It's the process of becoming your true self, not the version of yourself that society expects, or the version that's easy to show to the world, but the full, authentic you. Individuation isn't about perfection. It's about integration. It's about accepting that you're complex, contradictory, and human. But here's the most important part: when you embrace your shadow, you don't just transform yourself, you also transform your relationships. Think about how much conflict comes from projection. When you judge others for traits you can't face in yourself, you create distance. You build walls. But when you take responsibility for your shadow, you stop projecting. You start seeing others more clearly, and you start connecting with them on a deeper level. Here's something to consider: what would your relationships look like if you stopped projecting your fears and insecurities onto others? What if you could approach people with empathy instead of judgment? What if you could see them not as threats, but as mirrors, reflections of your own humanity? This is why the shadow needs you. It's not just a part of you that's been ignored. It's a part of you that's waiting to be understood, accepted, and transformed. And when you do this work, the benefits ripple outward. You become more authentic, more compassionate, and more capable of living a meaningful life. So, where do you start? Start by looking at the places in your life where you feel stuck. The patterns that keep repeating. The emotions that keep bubbling up. These are the clues that point to your shadow. Start by questioning the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Are you really the calm, collected person you present to the world, or is there anger simmering beneath the surface? Are you really as selfless as you claim, or is there envy you're afraid to acknowledge? Start by being honest, not with others, but with yourself. This isn't a one-time process. It's ongoing. The shadow is never fully integrated. It's always shifting, always evolving. But every time you face it, you grow stronger. Every time you acknowledge it, you become more whole. And every time you integrate it, you take another step toward living authentically. Jung understood that the path to authenticity isn't easy. It requires courage, honesty, and a willingness to confront the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. But he also understood that this is where your power lies. The shadow isn't just the side of you that you fear, it's the side of you that needs you the most. And when you embrace it, you don't just transform yourself, you transform your life. The shadow as the bridge to your true potential. Let's think about what it means to live without fear of yourself. Most people spend their lives building walls around the parts of themselves they don't want to see. These walls feel safe. They give you the illusion of control. But the cost is enormous. Every brick in that wall is a missed opportunity. Every time you suppress your shadow, you lose access to the energy, wisdom, and creativity locked inside it. The truth is, those walls don't protect you, they trap you. Jung didn't see the shadow as a flaw to fix. He saw it as a bridge between who you think you are and who you could be. But to cross that bridge, you have to stop running from your darkness. You have to confront it. And when you do, you realize something profound. The shadow isn't working against you. It's trying to help you. It's trying to complete the picture of who you are. Imagine you've been carrying a heavy bag your whole life, but you've never opened it to see what's inside. You just know it's there, weighing you down. When you finally stop and open it, you find tools you didn't even know you had. That's what the shadow is, a collection of tools that have been hidden from you. And the only reason they've been hidden is because you refuse to look. But here's the catch: these tools aren't clean or polished. They're messy, they're complicated. They require effort to understand and use. Take fear, for example. Fear is often seen as something to avoid, but it's also a survival mechanism. It shows you what matters to you. If you're terrified of failing, it might mean that success is deeply important to you. If you fear rejection, it might mean that connection and belonging are values you hold close. Fear, when explored, points directly to your priorities. It shows you where your greatest opportunities for growth are hiding. Let's talk about guilt. Guilt is another emotion most people shove away. It's uncomfortable, so we suppress it, rationalize it, or bury it under distractions. But guilt carries information. It tells you where you've acted out of alignment with your values. It's not there to punish you, it's there to guide you. Ignoring guilt doesn't make it go away. Facing it, understanding it, and acting on it, that's how you grow. Jung believed that every emotion, trait, and impulse in the shadow has a counterpart in the light. Anger, when integrated, becomes strength. Fear becomes awareness. Envy becomes ambition. Even the traits we consider negative have something to offer if we're willing to listen. But most people don't listen. They let the shadow speak in whispers, in projections, in unconscious patterns, and then they wonder why they feel stuck. The shadow doesn't go away just because you ignore it, it waits. It waits for you to finally pay attention. When you do, something incredible happens. The traits you once feared start to work for you instead of against you. You stop being ruled by unconscious impulses because they're no longer unconscious. You start noticing patterns in your thoughts and behaviors, and instead of feeling trapped by them, you can change them. You stop projecting your insecurities onto others and start owning them. And when you own them, they lose their power to control you. Let's make this even clearer. Think about confidence. Everyone wants to feel confident, but most people think confidence comes from external validation, achievements, compliments, success. Jung would say that real confidence doesn't come from what you achieve, it comes from knowing who you are. And you can't fully know who you are if you refuse to look at your shadow. Confidence isn't about believing you're perfect. It's about accepting that you're not and being okay with that. When you know your strengths and your weaknesses, your light and your darkness, you stop needing other people to define you. You become grounded in yourself. This is why Jung's work is so revolutionary. He didn't just want people to overcome their fears, he wanted them to transform their fears into strengths. He didn't want people to suppress their anger, he wanted them to channel it into action. He didn't want people to avoid their envy, he wanted them to use it as fuel. The shadow isn't your enemy. It's the part of you that's been waiting to be understood. But let's not romanticize this process. Integrating the shadow isn't a quick fix. It's not something you do once and then move on. It's a lifelong practice. The shadow evolves as you do. Every time you grow, every time you face new challenges, new parts of the shadow emerge. This is why Jung called individuation the process of becoming your true self, a journey with no finish line. You don't reach a point where you're done, but that's not a bad thing. Growth isn't about reaching an end goal, it's about movement, progress, and discovery. Think about it like this: the shadow is a mirror. It reflects the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. And the clearer the reflection gets, the more you understand yourself. But mirrors don't just show you who you are, they also show you who you could be. The shadow doesn't just reveal your flaws, it reveals your potential. It shows you the traits, talents, and desires you've been too afraid to claim. Let's pause here. What would your life look like if you fully embraced the parts of yourself you've been avoiding? What would change if you stopped treating your emotions as problems to be solved and started seeing them as messages to be understood? What kind of person could you become if you stopped running from your shadow and started working with it? This is the power of integration. It's not about fixing yourself, it's about becoming yourself. It's about stepping into your full humanity, with all its light and darkness, and realizing that both are essential. Jung believed that wholeness is the goal of life. Not perfection, not success, not happiness, wholeness. And wholeness requires courage. The courage to face the parts of yourself you fear. The courage to accept them. And the courage to let them transform you. So, what does this mean for you? It means that the next time you feel anger, fear, envy, or guilt, don't push it away. Don't try to fix it. Sit with it. Let it show you what it has to say. It might be uncomfortable, but it will also be honest. And honesty is what leads to growth. It also means paying attention to the patterns in your life. The conflicts that keep repeating. The emotions that keep coming up. The traits you judge in others. These aren't random, they're signs. Signs that your shadow is trying to get your attention. The more you ignore them, the louder they'll get. But the moment you start listening, something shifts. The shadow stops being a burden and starts being a guide. This process doesn't happen overnight. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Because when you integrate your shadow, you don't just transform yourself, you transform the way you see the world. You stop being afraid of your darkness, and in doing so, you stop being afraid of the darkness in others. You approach life with more empathy, more understanding, and more authenticity. The shadow isn't something to fear. It's something to embrace. It's not the part of you that's broken. It's the part of you that's waiting. And when you finally meet it, when you finally let it show you what it's been holding, you realize that it doesn't weaken you, it empowers you. The side you fear doesn't need to be fought. It needs to be seen. And when you see it, you see yourself fully and completely for the first time.